Okay, everyone. Hi. We are going to start the meeting. We've got a really good group of people who have joined us already, and people will be continuing to join us, obviously, in the next few minutes. We'd like to say hello, though, to everyone, and welcome to the October program of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, and happy Halloween. I hope your fall is going well. I'm Glenda Bullock. I'm the program chair of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Our speaker today is with the Max Kade Institute for American Studies at the University of Wisconsin. And our online host for today's program is the Ann Arbor District Library, which provides promotional and tech support for us on Zoom, and for which we are very grateful. By now, we're all pretty familiar with how Zoom works, but if you don't want your face to show during the recording, we strongly recommend you turn off your video. Your microphone will be muted during the talk, but Antje will take questions at the end as time allows. You have two options for questions. You can either use the raise hand button, and Ben, who is engineering for us today, will unmute your microphone and call on you, and you can ask your question then. Or you can use the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and make sure you select Ann Arbor District Library as the recipient of the question, and then we will feed the questions to our speaker if you'd rather type out your question. One more tip, at the top right of your screen, there's a button that says view, and you will want to click on the speaker view or side-by-side view instead of gallery view for your best viewing experience. Before we start, we always have a little information about the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. We're an informal group of people who are interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. We have monthly talks between September and May. Pre-COVID, we met on the third Sunday of the month at the Mallox Creek branch of the Ann Arbor District Library. Since last year, we've been meeting like this on Zoom, and we're looking forward to the day when we can meet again in person. Just so you know, the most recent communication I had with the library indicated it probably won't be until next spring before we can meet in person. So we're going to have at least a few more online meetings like this one. We also have two participatory theme meals each year, and we are optimistically planning to have our first winter meal in 2 years, this December 19th. If you're a member, you should already have received your invitation. If you're not a member, that is easily fixed. Our membership is $25 a year for an individual or a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast, which is edited by Randy Schwartz. If you'd like to join our group, we would love to have you. You can find a membership form on our website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org. Just click on membership. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Antje Petty is the Associate Director of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her research focuses on the experiences of German-speaking immigrants and their descendants. She shares the resources of the Institute through a variety of public programs. And today she's going to be tracing the evolution of German-American cooking in America through the cookbooks that were published in German for these new immigrants. We are very happy you can join us today. Welcome, Antje.
Thank you, Glenda, for this nice introduction. I'm really thrilled to speaking to all of you in Arbor and across the country. Thank you for joining here on this Halloween day. I will share my screen, and Glenda, if you can let me know if this actually works out. Can you see the screen properly?
Yes, we can.
Super. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really delighted to speak about the German American cookbooks and food traditions today. A few words about my institute. Oops, just a second here. Okay, yeah, I'm with the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An institute, we research and do outreach on German-speaking immigrants that come to America, in particular the Midwest, and also the life and the and that of their descendants. We have a large library, one of the largest ones in the country actually, of German language materials that were created in America. So that's our little niche. That's books and letters and pamphlets and newspapers and anything you can imagine that were materials that were created by immigrants who spoke another language than English, in this German. And so that's the basis of our collection. Most of our materials come through donations. And this is also the basis of our research and outreach, including my presentation today. We are open to the public. Normally you can just walk in between 9 and 4 p.m., but currently because of the COVID pandemic, only by appointment. So my email is here on the screen and Glenda has it too. I encourage you to email me if you have any questions on the topic today or about us and our library. And definitely visit our website, mki.wis.edu, where there are lots of materials and yeah, on all kinds of topics. So to the cookbooks. It turns out the cookbooks are one of the largest in number on our shelves. When immigrants came here from German-speaking Europe to America, they brought yeah, not only their clothes and tools and various other things, but books. And next to Bibles and some cookbooks were the most yeah, popular ones. Basically 3 waves in the 1850s. Those were mostly people who came for economic reasons, but also political refugees after the failed revolutions in 1848-49, and they were mostly from the southwestern region. Then immigration stopped around the Civil War, and then picked up again in the 1870s with people coming from central German-speaking Europe, places like Westphalia, the Kingdom of Hanover, all the way up to the Danish border. And then another 3rd wave, which was the largest wave. People came in the 1880s from mostly the coastal regions, the Baltic Sea, Pomerania, Mecklenburg, Brandenburg, but also Silesia. All these regions are in Poland today, and not all of them Silesia is, and also the Russian Germans. Yeah, why is that important for cookbooks? Mostly because when these people came, most of them, there was no country that was called Germany. There were lots of smaller states that had very different traditions, cultures, spoke different languages, different dialects that were often mutually unintelligible. And those differences are reflected in the food traditions of people here. When I talk about the cookbooks, I will give a brief overview of the type of books we have at the Institute, then what's in those books, what the people cooked and ate, and how that changed over the editions of the cookbooks over decades, and then what else we find in them that is not just recipes, but other advice around food, especially recipes for sick people and community-based cooking. The very first cookbooks that were brought here from Germany, once the immigrants were here, they noticed that it was not always easy to exactly cook what they were used at home. So they had to make some adjustments, and very quickly publishing companies in this country saw a market, and they reprinted these cookbooks and made some initial small changes. Mostly that was in changing measurements. So in Europe at the time, it was largely measured in weight, and here in many cases in volume. So changing grams to teaspoons and that kind of things. And giving some English help, glossaries or translations. The very first cookbook that was published as a German-American cookbook was called the Höchst Nützliches Handbuch über Kochkunst, the most useful handbook on culinary art. That was in Cincinnati in 1842, followed by a small pamphlet for Pennsylvania Dutch speakers in 1848. And then 1856, the one that's pictured here is called the Complete Cookbook for the German-American Kitchen, including instructions on how to cut meat and other useful hints. And that cookbook, here's a page from that, and that's a classic example. It used the American measurements, and then it gave little hints on how to pronounce the German words. So here's the word Schinken. It's all printed in the German Fraktur. And then in brackets, it says ham, and that's printed in the English type or Latin type. And then followed by H-A umlaut M, and that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, ham. It says, yeah, pronounce it like this, and kind of between a German A and a German E. So that's the American sound. The next stage of cookbooks were cookbooks with German recipes that were especially rewritten for German Americans. And these books showed up in the 1870s to the 1890s. So several decades after the first wave of immigrants came here, and by then immigrants had learned more about local cuisine. They had to make bigger adjustments to the things that were available in this country to them. And they also had changed their taste a little bit. So that was all put into these books. And the most prominent of them was the so-called Kochbuch für die Deutschen in Amerika, Cookbook for Germans in America, which was published in 1879 by the Bromder Publishing Company in Milwaukee. And here, Mr. Bromder, the publisher, took the 22nd edition of a very popular German cookbook by the author Henrietta Davides and rewrote it for the American market. And I will talk about Henrietta Davides a little bit more later. George Bromder's wife, Henrietta Bromder, was actually the one who tried out all these recipes and literally cooked through them and adjusted them and worked them into this cookbook. So it was hugely popular. It was reprinted several times, and in 1897 came out in a completely revised edition, now based on a different edition of the German cookbook by Henrietta Davides. And I talk about the recipes and the things in these cookbooks a little bit later. Germans also were interested in their neighbors' cuisine, especially Yankee cuisine. So the translations of English cookbooks were popular. Here is the Vereinigten Staaten Kochbuch, the United States cookbook that was translated for a German-speaking American audience and published in Philadelphia. Especially around the turn of the century, we find bilingual cookbooks like this one by Mrs. Lina Meyer, who was a teacher at a school in Milwaukee. It's called The Art of German Cooking and Baking in the English title. And this book literally has two columns, a German column and an English column, all recipes bilingual. Here's an example. On this page, we have traditional recipes like Königsberger Klops, which are like Swedish meatballs a little bit, but in a more lemony sauce with capers and so forth. And so that would be a very traditional Northern German recipe, actually. And then something like fried beef liver with breakfast bacon, which sounds very American, actually. And cow udder, which we would not find in a book today anymore, I believe. And last not least, German-American cookbooks were translated and adapted for the English-speaking market. And one of the bestsellers was what eventually was called just the Practical Cookbook, published by the Casper Publishing Company in Milwaukee. And this is a cookbook that our institute actually reprinted in facsimile form with a very good introduction by Lou Pitchman. It's now available, it's out of print, unfortunately, but it's available in its entirety digitally on the UW Madison Digital Collection website. So you can either Google that or use the link on this slide, and you can find everything in this book from 1904. And again, I will talk about it in a little bit more detail later. So who was this Henrietta Davides that everybody based their cookbooks on? She was a tremendously popular cookbook author in Germany. I think she was both Joy of Cooking, Martha Stewart, Julia Childs, everything wrapped in one. She was born in 1801 in Westphalia on the Dutch border. She was one of 13 children of a Lutheran pastor and a Dutch mother. She was homeschooled for almost her entire school career, became a school teacher later, but also for several years worked as a governess in a household in the port city of Bremen, and then in a similar position in a household in Switzerland. And at the age of 42, she became the headmistress of a school for girls in the little Westphalian town of Sprockvögel. And that building up there in the picture is the school, and today there is a little museum in there. So over these years, she had acquired a tremendous knowledge of recipes throughout the German-speaking world in Europe, actually. So very different from Bremen to Switzerland, the Dutch border. And now she was teaching these girls at the school and realized there was no cookbook out there that had a standardized way of teaching anybody how to cook. There were dozens and dozens of regional recipe books on the market, but they were all very inconsistent and definitely not a broad spectrum of what was cooked in German-speaking Europe. So she set out to write a cookbook that, as she said, will serve both her students, but also can be used by any cook and even the really expert chef who wants to entertain in large numbers. And she wanted to make sure that every recipe is standardized and easy to do. When the book was published in 1844, it was an instant bestseller. It immediately sold out, went into second edition, and very shortly after, Henrietta Davides could basically live off the income of this cookbook and gave up her job at the school and published more cookbooks for the rest of her life. Her own cookbook went through dozens of divisions even after her death, and the many other books that she published on all kinds of topics from gardening to recipes for children and so forth were also very popular. So these were the books that German immigrants brought with them and that then the American publishers used as the basis for writing the German-American cookbooks. What do we find in these cookbooks? I will just briefly talk about the various recipes, but also we find general cooking advice. That's not necessarily German, but you found this in all kinds of cookbooks. For example, what different herbs look like, as in this one, but then having the translation, the Kümmel for the German word and cumin seed for English. Also things like how to get rid of ants in the kitchen, how to scrub iron pots, and so forth. In the recipes, we distinguish today between recipes that are still found in Germany today, but not in America anymore. Recipes that have been forgotten in both Germany and America. Some pioneer and specialty recipes, some that came from the original German editions, but some that were already also included here from the American experience. And recipes that are very universal that you find in almost all European cuisines, like starch puddings, distinct American and Anglo recipes that now were part of the German-American experience, and then hybrid recipes and German recipes that now have become part of the American mainstream, but were not that when these books were published. Here are two recipes that cover two categories. The first one, as it's printed here, we would probably not find in any cookbook anymore. But it was a very basic recipe that you found throughout the German-American cookbooks. It's cream of black bread in this case, so the creams of bread, soups of bread were a staple and a basis for all kinds of other recipes, and were also used in the recipes for sick people quite a bit. Kirschengrütze, or cherry pudding, or any other fruit pudding. It's a very popular Northern German recipe. These are also popular in Scandinavia. So you have these fruit puddings that are thickened with starch, and then you pour over vanilla sauce or whipped cream. And to this day, they are very popular in those regions of Germany. But in America, if you ask someone what is a typical German recipe, this would probably not come up for most people. But at the time, with all the Northern German immigrants in the 1880s, this would have been very typical. One from the specialty column. The specialty column includes things like bear paws and turtle soup and various things. And here's one for badger roast, which I always like to quote, coming from Madison. Supposedly that badger roast tastes like a pork tenderloin or a young hare, and you marinate it in vinegar with lots of onions and carrots and bay leaves and other spices, and then roast it. A big part of these German-American cookbooks was the preservation of meats, fruits, and vegetables. And as you know, this was a big part of any cookbook at the time. We didn't have refrigeration as we do today. We didn't have freezers. So preservation meant pickling, smoking, salting, drying, whatever. But the German cookbooks, German-American cookbooks, of course, had a lot of the German-European recipes in it, especially when it came to the preserving of meat. So the earlier Davides cookbook has 54 recipes only for sausage making and for cold smoking or cold curing meat, for example. Some of these sausages are now part of the American mainstream, but others you will probably not recognize so much, like the Weisswurst or white sausage or blood sausage and those kind of things. Then another big section was the use of leftovers. And especially in the 1897 edition, the second edition, that section was hugely extended. And it was unique to the German-American cookbooks and the German cookbooks from that second half of the 20th century. So this is not only a way for people who do not have much to waste, to not waste food and make good use of leftovers, but it's also a German attitude in general at the time, a virtue at the time, to be very frugal, to not be wasteful, and to use every scrap and definitely not throw things away. So the 1897 Davides edition of this chapter says at the very beginning, there are 4 essential rules for the good housewife. Number 1, cleanliness. Number 2, economy. Number 3, care and deliberation. And number 4, being ready to use everything you have in your kitchen at any time. And that is how these recipes are built. Or as Mr. Brumder said in his prefix of the 1879 edition, the period of excess and waste has passed. one should strive to learn frugality, and this cookbook is intended to teach frugality in the household, especially in this country, and that means the United States, where not only men, but also women to a certain extent are self-made, and self-made is the English term used in the German text. The will to save is not as lacking as the knowledge to do so. And here is one example of a recipe that refers to what to do with leftover meat. And in fact, in the second edition of the cookbook, the Bilingual Cookbook, that was edited by Chicago socialite, actually, but she also did a lot of cooking. She translated the White House cookbook for the German market. And she had a section in there talking about how awful it is what's done with leftovers in the American cuisine, that every leftover meat turns into kind of a hash that is unpalatable. And so she sets out to deliberately find good recipes of what to do with leftover meat. So this one recipe here is basically a beef stew. I used leftover meat and everything else you might find in your pantry or so on at the time. One huge section in these cookbooks has to do with a meal tradition in Germany. And if any one of you have been to Germany, you might have seen places like these, the so-called cafes and Konditoreien. So in Germany, there is a difference between a bakery where breads are sold and a conditorei where you find the cakes and the tarts and the sweets and candy and so forth. And those are usually connected with a cafe, and you've seen Germans sit there around in the afternoon drinking their coffee and their tea and have cake. So this in Germany actually is a separate mealtime. Cakes are not served as dessert as they're here. So the German meal times would be a very light breakfast, usually a little bread roll, an open faced with jam or maybe a slice of cheese, some coffee. Then lunch is the big meal, the warm cooked meal. Then in the afternoon, you have coffee and tea and cake and cookies. And in the evening, you have another lighter meal, usually more hearty, open-faced sandwiches with cold cuts and maybe a salad and so forth. So this afternoon coffee and tea, on a regular normal workday, people would probably just have their coffee and their tea with a little bit to nibble on. But it's also a social event, especially on weekends, on Sundays. That's when extended families meet and invite each other and then you have lots of these cakes being served, and that's where you socialize. It's also was a way for women to socialize in the afternoon. You invite your female friends over and eat cake and drink coffee and tea in the afternoon. So this was passed on in the German American cookbooks. And here's a picture. Picture is probably taken around 1870 and was published in the Milwaukee Sentinel a couple of years later. It shows the basically high society German women of Milwaukee. It says here, they're for Kaffeeklatsch, and that's a good German word, meaning klatsch is kind of talk or gossip over coffee, and that's where you met. Says it was the favorite diversion for Milwaukee ladies in the latter part of the last century. The photograph was taken in 1870. Among those pictures were Mrs. Maiswinkel, Mrs. Uline, and Mrs. Kiewert, and so forth. So the Bilingual cookbooks had big, large sections on recipes for cakes, dozens and dozens of recipes, but also, and this is where I think the Martha Stewart part comes in, the Henrietta Davides version and then the German American versions showed how to entertain at these coffee gatherings. For example, it says here, make sure in advance how to serve people, how to elegantly set your table, and then it gives various suggestions, what Kuchen to serve with your coffee, in this case, Rodernkuchen, Stollen, Schneckenkuchen, and so forth. And then how to proceed throughout the day, lead your guests into your backyard and have different cakes and maybe oranges and some gelees and cremes and so forth. So that is definitely a bigger event for your guests. And if it goes into the evening, finish off with serving some wine. And also in the same cookbook, this is the 1897 edition, are several pages on how to fold napkins and set the table. Here some nice napkin versions, some more. So this whole way of living of the coffee tradition was passed on, I would say, all the way into the early 20th century in German American communities. This is a big switch now from those recipes to recipes for sick people. As mentioned earlier, for the use of, for preservation of foods and meats and vegetables and so forth, as much as we didn't have refrigeration in the 19th century, there also weren't the medical aids that we have today. No vaccinations, no antibiotics. Medicine was, in many ways in the infancy, and especially infectious diseases were hard to treat at the time. And what did you do? You tried to remedy them with food and drink. And so the cookbook, the German American versions here have large sections on recipes for sick people. And in fact, George Bromder and his wife added even more recipes to their German American edition than the original German edition had of the Davides book, by incorporating another book that was especially for recipes for sick people from the German tradition into this German American cookbook. So here here's the quote from the preface that basically summarizes the idea behind this. For many illnesses, a good diet is much more important than a whole stack of doctors' prescriptions, which are often nothing but mixtures, band-aids, and lotions. And here the basic recipe again is the bread water for sick people, so watered down starch. What illnesses were covered here? So we have whole sections that have recipes for scarlet fever, smallpox, tuberculosis, overweight and underweight people, high blood pressure, anemia, diabetes, hemorrhoids, osteoporosis, gout, rheumatic fever, indigestion, and also for nursing mothers and infants. And here just a few examples. Here's a diet for the obese, as it's called in the 1879 edition. And if you look at this, it's a daily plan on what to eat. So start out with some beefsteak with a cup of picotea without milk. For lunch, have low-fat cheese, low-fat salt meat, oysters, maybe a glass of wine or water. For dinner, a bowl of soup, roast with a salad, maybe another glass of wine. In the evening, just cold roast and tea and without milk. So when you look at this, it's basically a low-carb diet, Atkins style or whatever. It's, that we have heard of before today too. It also has some sections in there, some admonishments, especially for German males, saying the German man should give up his potatoes and his beer if he actually really wants to diet. Here's a recipe for scarlet fever, and it's tried, to get liquid into people. So it's broth, mild broth, maybe some light fruit compotes that are only slightly acidic, maybe for children, diluted milk, soup, and then various recipes that actually say how to make these things. But it also includes some advice that you would usually not find in a cookbook. And here is a quote from the 1897 edition. A while ago, a new remedy against scarlet fever came into vogue: to rub a patient with lard right on the onset of the illness, every morning and evening over the whole body except the head. Even if the fever is gone after 10 days, the lard ointment should be continued for 3 weeks. This will relieve the itching and burning of the skin. However, few people use the lard treatment today. Using a dietary plan exclusively is much preferred. Last not least, one observation usually not found in a cookbook. It is so much easier to bear this illness if the patient's room does not exceed 60 degrees Fahrenheit, if it gets aired out several times a day, if the patient is covered with a light blanket, and if he gets to wear a fresh shirt once in a while. All too often one sees a patient suffering from a stuffy room, living in a room, suffering from scarlet fever, living in a room with closed windows with his bed right up to the stove. It is not hard to imagine how you can die from this disease under these circumstances. And the same as there weren't many ways to treat illnesses that we have today, there also were not the formulas and the ways to nourish infants that could not be nursed for whatever reason. So there's a large section on how to find ways for an infant to get nourishment if the mother cannot nurse. It says here, if a mother cannot nurse, find a wet nurse. If a wet nurse cannot be found, dilute cow, horse, or donkey milk. Dilute the milk with sugar water. If the child doesn't tolerate this, add 2/3 ounce of baking soda. While it is relatively easy to get fresh milk in the city, in the countryside, this is often not the case in the city. Try diluted condensed milk, Liebig soup, or Nestle flour for the children. If the child does not tolerate this, give her a beaten egg while diluted in water with a dash of condensed milk or clear meat broth. So you can see here how this is really not advantageous for a child that can't get mother's milk, and how difficult it would be to survive under those circumstances. So I mentioned already the different editions these books went through, and some were completely rewritten. And there were big changes that we can observe from the earlier ones that appeared around 1850 to the latest ones that appeared in the early 20th century. The biggest first change was the change in measurements, followed by new ingredients or substitute ingredients for things that were available in the United States. Sometimes very specific. For example, if a German recipe called for a very specific North Sea flatfish, for example, then the American recipe would substitute a fish that was more easily available here, mostly in the Midwest, actually. Cooking and baking methods changed over time, and not only because people acculturated more here, but also because technology changed. By the early 20th century, we actually have very different stoves in kitchens than we had in the mid-19th century. And then in the later editions, we also see a change in meal times and tastes, and development towards German-American cuisine as we might understand it today. So here are two ads from a German cookbook, and they reflect the use of American ingredients. The first one is an ad for cornstarch. So the German-American recipes would then use cornstarch instead of potato starch, which was the starch of choice in the German edition. Baking soda shows up in German cookbooks. Baking soda was not used in traditional German recipes. So any recipe you see that uses baking soda is coming from the Anglo tradition or the Irish tradition, and definitely was acquired on this continent. With the ways of baking, and there are some quotes in it that reflect on the history of settlement here of German settlers. And this quote is from the 1897 edition. Old settlers remember the days when in many farmsteads there was no cast iron oven. Bread had to be baked in cast iron pots, which had cast iron lids. Such a pot, a Dutch oven, that was the term used there, had to be placed in an open fireplace onto glowing coal. Even the lid had to be covered with red hot coal. Baking required a lot of care. Women suffered greatly from the embers of the open fire. So this kind of baking is what a settler woman would have done who found herself pretty isolated, let's say in central Wisconsin on a farm, which was different from what she had known at home in Germany. Even in the villages, you had bakers or communal ovens, and this kind of isolation, doing everything for yourself for a while would have been new and would have definitely been a unique American experience for those German immigrant women. That of course changed quickly as communities grew bigger and towns grew bigger, and yeah, but it was still reflected in the cookbooks. Mealtimes. I mentioned the traditional mealtimes before and how they were part of the cookbooks, especially the afternoon coffees. So with the later edition, you see a switch to to American mealtimes. They are breakfast dishes that are very clearly big American breakfast, with the eggs and the bacon and the sausage. And with the lighter lunch, the Casper book, for example, includes a special section for lunch meats and lunch sandwiches in 1897. And so German Americans adjust to the way the American economy and life works, that you don't have time at lunchtime to cook your big meal. You bring something you can eat, and that's often a sandwich. Then you will find change in tastes over time. So in the earlier cookbooks, when we talk about bread baking again, there were dozens and dozens of recipes that used all kinds of grains for German breads, that were used sourdough frequently, and yeah, had anything from rye to millet and on and on. And the later editions had fewer bread recipes to begin with, and then most of them were based on wheat and used yeast as a leavening agent. And then we find this in one of the cookbooks from 1919, the Rezeptbuch und Hausarzt. It says here, 2 things are especially important for good bread: lightness and sweetness. Heavy bread, that is to say bread that is neither light nor fluffy, or sour bread, is only suitable for piglets. A loaf of perfect bread, white, sweet, tender, and elastic, with a golden brown crust, is evidence of a superior education and the basis of all good nourishment. So quite a change in taste over 5 decades. And then in around the turn of the century, first English translations of German American cookbooks appeared, or editions that were particularly made for an English-speaking market. And one of the most prominent there was this book by the Casper Publishing Company in Milwaukee. It's on the left there, that's the one our institute reprinted. This book had made a number of changes. It was based partially on the German American cookbook by Brumner, and also based on the 35th edition now of the Davides cookbook in Germany. But the Casper Publishing Company added a really extensive German-English and also English-German glossary of culinary terms at the end. They separated the chapters now into typical American recipes. They call it the Amerikanische Küche, American kitchen. Recipes that were actually folded in with the other German recipes in the German American cookbooks of Brumner. Then Casper deleted or greatly reduced seven chapters in the European edition, including the ones that had to do with curing meats and saving time tips, being more efficient in the kitchen, and also that big section on the Kaffee and Teegesellschaften. The edition that we use for a reprint is the 1904 edition that was called a Practical Cookbook, or in its long title, German National Cookery for American Kitchens, a Practical Book of the Art of Cooking as Performed in Germany. And here's just a little glimpse at it. Here's the last, on the left is the last page of the table of contents. So the upper part are the German recipes, and you see how it's divided there. Pastry and cakes, he still has 92 German cakes recipes in there. Still preserved and dried fruits and vegetables, but not that many recipes anymore as in Brumner, all combined. And on. And then the American kitchen. So what is in the American kitchen? What does he at that point, what does the publishing house consider typical American as in contrast to German American? And these are the recipes that you find in that section. So under soups, for example, you find chowders, clam chowders, corn chowders, and also canned tomato soup. Under veggies, baked beans, recipes with squash and pumpkin. Under the meats, you find corned beef and Yorkshire pudding and spare ribs. Under fish, baked cod, shellfish, clam fritters and crab pie. Poultry, anything with turkey, pot pies, bread. Now you find the ones that use soda and like soda biscuits, but also the classic bun, fritters, and anything that was done on the griddle, muffins. Cakes, you have fruit cake and ginger snaps, and the big pie and pudding section. So the pie, is a very American recipe to this day. So that the whole idea of the way a pie is made would not have been German. Then under the canned recipes, again, the same, like canned squash and so forth, and beverages, like ginger beer and similar things. So all these recipes, again, would have, or not all of them, but many of them would have shown up in the German American cookbooks, but would have been folded in as part of the German American experience. On the right, just a random page from the glossary and the English to German version. So it's quite detailed and actually useful even today to interpret old recipes. Here's a page of some sample recipes. I just used one of the dumpling recipes. There are 47 altogether, and savory dumplings and sweet dumplings. And so here are some bread dumpling, egg dumpling, various ways. And all of these, even though they are not specified as such in this English edition, they usually have a very regional background. So these recipes, not all of them were used all over Germany, but were regional and had made it into these larger cookbooks. On the right, just a little example of pork recipes, 29 altogether here, like smoked pork, how to cook a smoked pig's head, pickled pork, pork sausages, pork chops, and so on. So yeah, what has changed over time? What do we still find? And if I would see you in person today, I would ask you, what is typical German food for you? Or what is typical German American food for you? And also, do you eat German dishes? And do you have German food dishes in your family or in your community? If you like, you can type those answers into the chat. But I will address the other two questions here then. What typical American foods have a German background? And you can see by my image here, I put in the brat, the classic bratwurst, but look how it's eaten today in America. The American brat is in a bun and has some condiments over it. Sometimes that's sauerkraut. This is not how Germans would eat a brat. You would always, to this day, would find it separate on the plate, like my earlier image, with the sauerkraut next to it or whatever you serve with it, the mustard next to it. The same with the American hamburger. There is a German dish, frikadelle or boulette or whatever you call it. Yeah, basically beef patties, but again, they would be served with a side of potatoes or mashed potatoes and gravy, but not in a bun. So this is the American mealtime tradition of having to eat things on the go, where you have to keep your fingers clean and have put things inside a piece of bread to be able to eat it quicker and faster and cleaner too. That's just one example, and you might come up with many more. I already mentioned the cherry soup or the rote Grütze. That was a big part of German American cuisine, especially from Northern Germany, from that last group of immigrants who came here, which you do not find in this country anymore. And then there's the curious history of the pretzel, which in its form as it's pictured here is actually a very regional dish from the region of the Alsace or the lower Rhineland. The pretzel shape is common all over the German cuisine, but these big yeast-based salt pretzels are from there. And in America today, and that's a whole story in itself, they now have become a presence in every mall, and they have been adjusted to American tastes. I've seen them with pineapple pieces and chili peppers and other things. And also in American mind are the traditional German food now, even though they were very, very regional. And then over time, German cuisine or all ethnic cuisines in the way became part of a regional cuisine. Here's a picture from Milwaukee. It's a postcard that was printed in the early 20th century, and it says touring in Milwaukee, not in German Milwaukee. But if you look at all the things there, they are very much stereotypical German American, from the big beer barrel to the little wiener dog there, the brewery in the background, on and on. There's, except for one food item here, they are all of a German tradition, a German American tradition in Wisconsin. And that one item that's not of a German tradition is the cheese factory. Yeah, so with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
So we're going to, again, invite people. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and Ben will happily read them for Antje. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question in person. And Antje, I wonder, who would you say was the target audience for these books? Was it a middle class, an aspiring to the middle class housewife? Who would be the target audience?
The German language books?
Yes.
So in Germany, so I should also say at the mid-19th century in Germany, when these, or second half of the 19th century, when these books were published, the literacy level in Germany was actually quite high, and the actual education of girls was quite high. So even in the lower strata of society, people could read enough to read a recipe and read the Bible and so forth. So in some way, they were actually geared at everybody. And especially the Davides book strove to address everybody. And that was part of her success, that literally they were affordable, these books, and everybody purchased them. At the same time, books was kind of an ideal to, the whole, there's a German word for it, Bildungsideal, the ideal of education and moving on in society. That was also part of the times. And again, the cookbooks would have been part of striving to better your cooking, better your household, have more education. Mm-hmm. So the German American books really were purchased across the spectrum by German-speaking Americans.
Looks like we're getting some nice questions in the chat here. I can read a couple of them for you. We've got Mary says, sadly, no recipes or cookbooks have been passed down in our family from our German great-grandparents. Do you have a German cookbook to recommend for someone who hasn't before cooked German foods?
Yeah, if you want to delve into these old recipes, I suggest to look into this book, and maybe I can put the link into the chat. Otherwise, there were some books in the past which unfortunately have gone out of print, so I'm not currently aware of a generic English language cookbook. There was one, and you find it probably in a library. It's actually published in English by the Dr. Oetker company in Germany, Dr. DR and then OETKER. And that has basic German recipes as it's understood from Germany, and it covers various regions. It's not a very big book. Mm-hmm. It's very simply written. So I think that would be a good one if you can get your hands on it.
Okay, and it looks like some of the folks who are watching right now are tossing some suggestions in. So I would ask people to take a peek at the chat if you want some of our viewers' suggestions. You mentioned low-fat cheese in the diet for obesity. Was there really low-fat cheese back then, or was this more about choosing lower-fat cheeses in general rather than a low-fat version of a regular cheese?
That's actually a very, very, very good question. I think it's probably the first version, yeah. So low fat today sometimes means no fat in some dishes and yogurts and so on. So back then, yes, it would be a cheese that had lower fat rather than a second version. That's a very good point.
Okay, let's see. And again, if people want to raise their hands to ask a question in person, feel free to do that using the I assume, Ben, where is the raised hand?
You will see it on reactions.
Under reactions?
Yep, reactions, and you can do raise hand. Another user asked, can we please get the slide with the contact info on it, please?
Yeah, I can. My contact info?
I think so.
I think it was, yeah, the slide that you had.
Yeah, I share my screen again. I also just took a quick glance at the chat, and so, can you see that now, the contact slide?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, please email me. That's the best way to reach me, apetty@wis.edu. and yeah, explore our website. So I'd asked the question, what is typical German food for you? What do you do in your family? And I just glancing at some of the things in chat, I think see like Sauerbraten, bread pudding, rouladen, and potato salad with vinegar and bacon. What else do I see here? Panhas. Yeah, so all the ones that came up so far, I have to say, are all recipes that are from the Southwest, and recipes that very first German immigrant group would have brought to this country. And that's, for me, one of the fascinating things, if you ask about food traditions today, that the traditions of these earlier immigrants, who were actually less numerous than the later waves of immigrants, have become what's associated with an ethnic cuisine in this country today. So I'm from Northern Germany, for example. I had never Sauerbraten when I was still in Germany, because that's just not in the way, I mean, we have pickled beef and so forth, but not in the way a Sauerbraten is understood here. And other recipes. So that's one of these fascinating things about traditions, how they're passed on. And yeah, there are various theories of why that might have happened. One being that the later immigrant groups had to rely on the support systems of the earlier excuse me, groups, and then with that took on the traditions.
Let's see. We had one person ask if you could comment on this new settlement cookbook. Are you familiar with that? The new settlement cookbook. This is my grandmother and mother-in-law each had a copy from the 1920s.
Yeah, excuse my voice. Yeah, I'm very familiar with the cookbook. It's was created in Milwaukee by a German Jewish immigrant woman, and it has a lot of recipes in it, and it was created as part of a help book for the assimilation of new Jewish immigrants who mostly at that time in the late 19th century came from Eastern Europe. And but her being Lucy Cantor being of German background, a lot of the recipes she has in there are basically German recipes and German American recipes, of course, adjusted to Jewish food ways and food needs. So it's a very interesting cookbook, and the whole settlement movement actually is a very interesting phenomenon at the time. Sorry, my voice.
I had a question that came in directly to the library channel asking, what about Christmas baking? Is that included in the cookbooks? So many of those traditions have been incorporated into US Christmas baking.
Yeah, a very good question. And it's incorporated, but it's not necessarily identified as this is a Christmas recipe. And the reason why is because the readers at the time would have known it's a Christmas recipe. So the same way as when Americans see a fruitcake in a cookbook and would probably not bake that for a summer cookout, Germans would have known which of these recipes they would use for which holidays. And yes, they are all in there. So anything from the stuffed goose for the main course to the various cakes and Lebkuchen and so forth, they would bake at Christmas time. And other things like the special wine drinks, like sweet Woodruff infused wine for Mayfest and things like that. Again, I would not say this is a drink you would usually drink at Mayfest. It's, yeah, everybody knew that's when you would have it, and that's when the sweet Woodruff is blooming, and that's basically the only time you can make that specific drink.
I've got a question here from William. He says, I found that the German restaurants where I live in Brooklyn serve mostly meats and potato dishes with few vegetables. Is this typical of the German diet?
So yes and no. And here we go. Also, it comes to what is available and when. So if you think of Germany and also then think of these regions like Wisconsin, where the Bilingual Cookbook was written, the growing season is very short. So the traditional recipes, for example, let's say a Christmas meal, you would only find what's available then, and that does not include fresh vegetables. So that included pickled things, sauerkraut, pickled beans. You would never find a salad on a traditional German Christmas menu. And so that they did not eat vegetables is not true, but the fresh vegetables were really limited to that season when it was available. And I mean, you have things like fresh white asparagus, but that is literally a season of a couple of weeks to this day, actually. And then, yeah, you would have the various pickled version with the meals at other times of year.
Well, speaking of pickled things, Jacqueline says, can you elaborate a bit on pickled herring salad? My German grandmother made it every New Year's.
Mm-hmm. So do I. Yeah, so pickled herring is very much a Northern German thing. And it's not just one pickled herring. Usually when you find it in stores here, it's a herring and wine sauce or herring and sour cream. But if you have been to a fish store in Northern Germany, you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of smoked fish and different herring types. So, yeah, and within these Northern German regions, every North Sea island has their own little version of it. And the one that was passed down in my family, for example, it's this pickled herring. In Germany, it's called the Bismarck herring. It's a lot like the herring and wine sauce. So that's easy to make here then, and it includes apples and red beets and eggs and just a little bit of, what else? Pickles, not much, but yeah, and then it's kind of has a little bit of sour cream and a dash of mayonnaise with it, and you eat it with white bread. So, but there otherwise, this is called a red herring salad, but there are people who make white herring salad that wouldn't have the beets in them, and so there are many, many varieties on these. And these early cookbooks have some of those in them, but these are the kind of recipes that would have disappeared in the later edition. And I don't think there's one in the, there's pickled herring in the Casper book, but I don't think a pickled herring salad, if I remember correctly.
Another one that I got in as a direct message says, would a book have been part of a bride's dowry?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, anybody else know? Let me know.
Let's see. One person asks if you can comment or if you know anything about the history of the Black Forest cake, Black Forest cherry cake.
I do not know much about the history of that cake. I just know it's a very traditional cake that dates back a while, and in German it's called Kirschkuchen and not Kirschenkuchen, and Kirsch actually is the liquor, Kirschen are the cherries, so it has cherries in them, but the distinguishing part is the Kirsch liquor, which is usually left out in the United States because you can't put alcohol on cakes. But the real original Kirsch torte would have the liquor in it. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I don't know much more about that history.
That might be all of the questions. So we're going to thank you very much for your presentation. And I am looking now for my my closing remarks. So thank you. Thank you, Antje. We really appreciate that. And now we know we're all pretty hungry. And although it is probably just about 4 o'clock in Wisconsin, it is now a little after 5 here in the Eastern time zone. So we're going to wrap up now. Thank you everyone for coming and for viewing, and thank you to the Ann Arbor District Library for your usual fine job of engineering our program. We just want to remind everyone that we have another program coming up in about 3 weeks. It is going to be on what people drank during and after Prohibition in the United States with Tammy Coxon. And Tammy was also going to be providing us with some of the cocktails that she'll be talking about in case you are interested in mixing something up to enjoy while you're watching her program. So they'll be on the 21st. You'll be getting an invitation from us. In probably just a couple of weeks. The information will be going up on our website within a day or so, though. So if you want more information, check out culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org. And again, thanks so much to our speaker. Thanks to everyone for watching. Hope to see you next month, and have a happy Halloween. And for that, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you, and thank you everybody. And again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Bye-bye.